Recruiting is the process of creating a reasonable pool of qualified candidates for a job opening. Notice that this definition identifies the fact that we need qualified applicants. In a recent study, 84% of HR professionals reported candidates having applied skill deficits, such as problem-solving skills, and 68% were having difficulty in filling jobs. Recruiting does us no good if the candidates whom we attract are not qualified for the work. In recruiting, we want to use a series of tools to show the candidates why they might want to become part of the organization. But it's critically important that the candidates that we show are in fact qualified for the job we need to fill. When should we go through the recruiting process, and what alternatives do we have to recruiting? And who should we recruit, or where should we recruit our applicants from in terms of sources and methods? We have to set policies on these topics in order to maintain consistency, and we need consistency in order to be fair and equitable so that we can defend our processes if it becomes necessary. So, what do we have to think about, and in what level of detail? We have to think about a lot of things as we work to ally a shortage of people within a company. We need to determine how we're going to go through the recruiting process before we start trying to recruit new members into our workforce. Among other things, we have to answer the following questions. Under what conditions will we recruit new people into the company? Where should we recruit? What primary recruiting sources will provide us our best recruits? We have to make these determinations based on our particular company characteristics, taking into account all of the information from our forecasting processes. We might be able to solve our problem with temporary employees instead of new full-time workers. We have to weigh all of the available options as an example, and we should generally have a policy that tells us when we should use each option. We need to analyze each of the options for mitigating a labor shortage other than making new hires, and we need to create a policy concerning when each of these options is useful to our organization. We also need to identify our effective labor market. Do we plan to recruit only from local sources as an example? The first factor is simple. Can we find the right number and types of employees if we recruit locally? If so, then we may be able to work only in our local labor market. We have to create policies concerning when and how we recruit from our current employee pool and when we go outside the organization. Why? Probably the biggest reason is that our employees perceive fairness in our recruiting process. They might begin to show less loyalty to the organization because they feel the organization failed to show them loyalty through the recruiting decision. If our policies say that we go outside for recruits, then it's unlikely that anyone in the organization would have the skill set necessary to do the job identified in our job specification. We bring new people with new ideas in the organization with different skills. We may also identify specific occupations in our organization that we typically recruit from the outside, usually due to the need for this specialized skill set. These are just a few of the things that we need to consider as we create our recruiting policies specific to internal or external methods of recruitment. Internal recruiting involves filling job openings with current employees or people employees know. Here, we'll discuss internal recruiting sources, promotability ratings, and managerial sponsorship, and the advantages and disadvantages of internal recruiting. There are two common types of internal recruiting: promotions from within and employee referrals. When it comes to promotion from within as an internal recruiting method, the organization has several options. We can use open, targeted, or closed recruiting methods. Open recruiting consists of advertising the job openly within the organization, and anyone who meets the qualifications can apply for the job opening. Targeted recruiting is pretty much what it sounds like. We do not openly advertise the position internally. Instead, we ask managers to privately nominate workers who they feel would be able to do the job that needs to be filled. HR then evaluates the candidates put forward by the managers and then forwards the list of the best candidates to the hiring manager. Finally, closed recruiting occurs when hiring managers have a need to fill a position and they communicate that need to HR. HR recruiters then search the organization's files for people who have the requisite skills and qualifications and send a list of such individuals to the hiring manager. One of the difficult issues the organization may run into if it chooses an internal recruiting option is the presence of a bona fide seniority system, meaning a system that gives preference to individuals with longer tenure in the organization. We can do some things within the organization to make internal recruiting processes go a bit smoother in most cases. We may use some other tools to assess promotability in our efforts to find the best qualified individuals within an organization. We can have each of our employees complete a self-assessment, and we can also ask peers to assess their coworkers for promotability. We can also request managerial sponsorship for a person to be considered for job opportunities through internal recruiting. In this case, we would ask managers to provide their sponsorship for an individual before that person would be considered for a promotion through the internal recruiting process. Possible advantages of internal recruiting include increases in organizational commitment. The internal recruit will be more able to learn about the big picture of the company, and the individual also has shown at least some interest in the organization. Further, the organization has existing knowledge of the applicant and a record of previous work. The organization can save money by recruiting internally because of lower costs, and internal recruiting is usually faster. Disadvantages include the pool of applicants being significantly smaller in internal recruiting, and there'll still be a job to fill when all is said and done. Further, success in one job doesn't necessarily mean success in another. An external candidate may have better qualifications, and current employees may feel entitled. We may create or perpetuate a strong resistance to change or stifle creativity and innovation because everyone in the organization, even new hires, are part of the old organizational culture. Understanding internal recruiting enables managers to make the best possible hiring decisions. External recruiting is the process of engaging individuals from the labor market outside the firm to apply for a job. External recruiting can also be accomplished in either an open or targeted manner, in much the same way as internal recruiting can. If we have an open recruiting effort, we'll provide the job information for anyone who wishes to apply. If, however, we used targeted recruiting, for example, through a headhunter, we would seek out specific individuals with necessary skills and invite them to apply for the job opening. When we decide to recruit from external sources, what options do we have? Where would you recruit? We have to look at the type of person that we're trying to find and then go to the source or sources that will most likely provide that type of person. Without actually being recruited, good candidates may come to an organization cold and ask for a job. Recruiting takes place at high schools, vocational or technical schools, and colleges and universities. Temporary agencies provide part-time or full-time help for limited periods of time. Public agencies are state employment services. They generally provide job candidates to employers at a very low or no cost. Private employment agencies are privately owned and charge a fee for their services. General employment agencies operate on a for-profit basis. Some of them charge job seekers for their services and others charge the employer. Contingency agencies offer employees to the employer and are paid when a job candidate is hired by the employer. Retained search firms or executive recruiters are paid to search for a specific type of recruit for the organization and will be paid regardless of success in their recruiting efforts. It is important to use the appropriate source to reach qualified candidates. As you can see now, there are a number of options when recruiting externally. Regardless of the method, however, external recruiting has gone mobile and agile to a great extent. As a result, we want to pay attention to the effectiveness of our recruiting methods. Some methods can give us too many new recruits to review, costing us valuable time and money. Other options will not give us enough pool so that there's not flexibility in whom to choose, while still other options will cost too much for the results that we get. So the process of recruiting new employees has to be targeted a bit better than we might think. All management functions are subject to constraints and challenges, and the recruiting function is no different. Probably the most obvious constraint is money. We have to live within our budgets in all cases, and recruiting is no exception. There are many organizational policies that can affect our recruiting efforts. We have to be familiar with such policies in detail to take them into account as we go through the recruiting process. Below are some of the policies that may affect recruiting. Whether we have a promote from within policy or not affects how we recruit. Our policies on temporary to permanent employees would also affect how we recruit in most cases. We're also affected in our recruiting efforts by organizational image in markets from which we source our recruits. Organizational image can play a significant part in determining our ability to source the people we need from the communities around us. The recruiter is, in fact, one of the primary factors responsible for an applicant showing interest in our organization and in our jobs. How does the recruiter affect the job seeker, and how can we make sure that the effect is both positive and realistic? The recruiter is a critical piece in the recruiting process. In addition to their desire to perform, though, we have to ensure that our recruiters have certain skill sets to perform their jobs well. This means that recruiters have to want to listen and must have developed their own active listening skills so that they not only hear the words that recruits are saying, but also understand the context of the conversations so that they can empathize. If recruiters can do this, they can respond accordingly and usually successfully. Besides active listening skills, recruiters have to have a strong set of communication skills. The recruiter's job also includes successfully communicating with the hiring managers in the organization. We also have to train recruiters in the process of realistic job preview, known as RJP. So our selection and training of the recruiter is a major factor in our overall recruiting success. Most companies have come to the conclusion that realistic job previews are now a necessary part of the recruiting process. A realistic job preview, or RJP, is a review of all of the tasks and requirements of the job, both good and bad. A good job analysis with a clear job description should provide a good RJP. Satisfaction and organizational commitment would almost certainly go down, and this would happen literally right after taking the job if a realistic job preview is not provided. Is this what we want to do in a recruiting situation? How likely is it that a person would quit very early on if they felt like they were lied to in order to get them to accept a job? And if they do quit, we incur all of the recruiting costs again almost immediately. The recruiting process is expensive, and unless we identify and control those costs, the beneficial results may end up being outweighed by the costs. Recruiting costs for one management position can run as much as 30% of the individual's yearly salary or more, and this doesn't include later costs for things like selection and internal training. The recruiting yield ratio is a calculation of how many people make it through the recruiting step to the next step in the hiring process. Another measure that you probably want to use is how much it costs to get each person hired, or the cost per hire. You may also want to analyze how long it takes to get someone hired. This is called time to hire. Employee retention remains a critical issue for organizations and HR managers. You may also want to know how well your newly recruited employees perform on the job. Accurate measurement of the performance of recruitment makes organizations better. Selection is the process of choosing the best qualified applicant who's recruited for a given job. Selection is a critical management task, but why is it so critical to the organization? The reasons have to do with the negative consequences of bad hiring decisions, which are essentially the results of mismatches between jobs and employees. First, and probably most notably, while it's often important to fill jobs quickly, hurrying can result in a mismatch, or, as the old saying goes, haste makes waste. Think about your experiences in the past. Have you ever seen or been part of an organization with employees who did the minimum amount of work possible, who didn't ever go out of their way to help customers in any situation, and who didn't cooperate with others in the organization? Do you think that organization started out that way, or did people start out working hard and paying attention? In such an organization, what kinds of overall productivity are you trying to have? It's easier than you think to get into this type of situation. Just a few new hires who show this lack of concern for both the organization and its customers can be highly contagious. Another issue that makes selection critical is the potential for negligent hires. Almost every state in the United States recognizes this concept, so HR management must understand it well. A negligent hire is a legal concept that says if the organization hires someone who may pose a danger to coworkers, customers, suppliers, or others, and if that person then harms someone else in the course of working for the company, then the organization can be held liable to the individual's actions. So we have to make sure and take every legitimate attempt to find out if candidates have the potential to be a danger to others and weed them out during our selection process. There are many tools at our disposal during selection. There are interviews, written tests, physical tests, personality tests, honesty tests, drug testing, background checks of various types, and much more. Which tools should we use in which circumstances? Almost all of our selection devices are discretionary or optional. We don't have any written or physical ability tests, we don't have to administer any cognitive ability tests, and we don't have to provide tests for stamina, honesty, or judgment. The steps do, however, make logical sense. People apply for jobs, and the firm screens job candidates to narrow down the selection process. The screening can include tests of some type and an initial interview for top candidates. For lower-level jobs, it's not uncommon for the HR department to do the screening, conduct any testing and background checks, and send the best applicants to the manager the candidate would actually work for. The manager commonly conducts interviews and makes conditional job offers that may include drug screening and other physical exams. The final step occurs when the applicant is hired. But what do we need to look for in the selection process in order to put the right person in the right job? We need to attempt to assess three things: personality job fit, ability job fit, and person-organization fit. Our personality defines to a great extent who we are and how we act and react in certain situations. Some of us are strongly extroverted and enjoy working the crowd in a social setting, while others may be fairly introverted and feel extremely uncomfortable in such an environment. Some of us desire to try new things constantly, while others are more comfortable with things that they know well. There are many traits that help define our personalities, but the fact remains that each of us is different. You have to make an attempt to identify personality types and put them in positions that will be enhanced by their particular personality traits. This is called personality job fit. So if we need to hire an employee who will have to work the crowd in a sales job for our organization, would you want to hire someone who's very uncomfortable talking and relating to strangers? If we did hire that person, is it likely that the employee would succeed or fail in the position? Obviously, it's more likely that such a person would fail in that type of environment, so one of the things we try to determine in the selection process is personality job fit. In addition to personality job fit, we want to determine ability job fit. Every individual has a certain set of physical and intellectual skills, and no two people are exactly alike. Some people are very capable at working with computers, while others are more capable at a physical type environment. Still others may be able to successfully perform both physical and computer-based tasks, but they may have differences in how they analyze quantitative information, as an example. Each of us is more skilled at some things than others. Managers have to analyze the skill set and abilities of each subordinate or new hire to understand that person's individual limitations and their abilities. Finally, we have to be aware of person-organization fit when deciding on which candidate to hire. There are plenty of potential employees out there that have the required skills to do the jobs that we need them to do, and they may even have the right types of personality to be comfortable in that job. However, they might not fit well with the organization itself. Person-organization fit deals with the cultural and structural characteristics of the organization and how well the candidate will fit within that structure and culture. If a candidate works best in a decentralized organization with strong individual reward systems, and if we're hiring people to work in a tightly controlled and centralized team-based division, then it's unlikely that the candidate will be able or willing to conform to the requirements of the organization's structure and culture. Most managers will rank cultural fit as the most important item in a job interview, even above analytical thinking. There's one caveat to the concept of fit. We're not looking to hire people who are just like us. Research consistently shows the value of diversity in a business setting, so we don't want to hire all of the same types of person. The Uniform Guidelines on Employee Selection Procedures, known as the UGESP, provide information that can be used to avoid discriminatory hiring practices as well as discrimination in other employment decisions. Most often simply called the Uniform Guidelines, they were created to guide employers in their efforts to comply with the federal laws concerning all employment decisions, especially the selection process. Let's discuss some of the most important sections of the UGESP. The UGESP formalizes and standardizes the way in which the federal government identifies and deals with discriminatory employment practices. They define the concept of tests for employment that are used in either the selection process or in other employment decisions. But what is a test for employment? It's a pretty broad term. The guidelines themselves specifically say that they apply only to the selection procedures which are used as a basis for making employment decisions. We need to select for fit and follow the guidelines in every step of the selection process. In simple language, validity is the extent to which a test measures what it claims to measure. The Uniform Guidelines require validity in our selection procedures. It notes that users may rely upon criterion-related validity studies, content validity studies, or construct validity studies to validate a particular selection measure. But what are these validity measures? Criterion-related validity is an assessment of the ability of a test to measure some other factor related to the test. Content validity is an assessment of whether a test measures knowledge or understanding of the items it's supposed to measure. So, in measuring content validity for selection, we have to show that the content of a selection procedure is representative of important aspects of performance of the job. A selection procedure can be supported by content validity strategy to the extent that it's representative as a sample of the content of the job. In other words, if we have good work sample tests or other tests of knowledge, skills, or abilities that are directly applicable to the job, then we can probably use content validity to validate our selection procedure. Construct validity measures a theoretical concept or trait that's not directly observable. For construct validity to be applicable, we must demonstrate that a selection procedure measures a construct, something believed to be an underlying human trait or characteristic, such as honesty, and the construct is important for successful job performance. For example, intelligence is a construct that's measured by an IQ test, and research has supported the IQ test's validity. Intelligence is a major predictor of job performance. However, the Uniform Guidelines say that this method of validation is far more difficult to demonstrate than the other two options. So it would be best if you could show that a measure has criterion-related or content validity. Reliability is the consistency of a test measurement. In addition to being valid, for a measure to be useful in any type of testing, including employment testing, it needs to be reliable. We want our measures when we're working with people to be reliable measures, meaning they should be consistent over time and between people. Let's put validity and reliability together by stating the obvious. If a test is not reliable, it can't be valid. Then, we do preliminary screening that may include a background check, testing, and initial interviewing to narrow down the applicants to the best matches or fit for the job. Because these preliminary steps may not be done until later in the selection process, or may not be done at all, and because the process is essentially the same no matter when they're done, we'll discuss testing, interviewing, and background checks in 3 separate sections. But here, we'll discuss the application and resume and what you generally can and can't do with those pre-employment inquiries. As part of the selection process, the recruited candidates are typically asked to complete an application to provide biographical data. We need data to aid in selecting the best person for the job. Organizations may use different application forms for different jobs. Why does the company need candidates to fill out an application if it already has a resume with the same information? There are a couple of reasons. First, the application gives the company information on the applicant in a standard form. This makes it easier to quickly scan and evaluate different applicants. Second, applications almost always have some legal language or disclosures that must be agreed to by the applicant. This information will generally include language to inform the applicant of an employment at will clause, allow the company to conduct background and reference checks with the applicant's permission, tell the applicant that the company will conduct some mandatory tests prior to final employment, and inform the applicant that any false information provided will be grounds for immediate termination of any relationship between the company and the applicant. In reality, we use applications and resumes for much of the same reasons. We're trying to figure out your basic skill set, background, work history, education, and other core information. One area we absolutely want to check is educational level, because as you can see from the previous sections of this course, it's one of the most commonly exaggerated items on a resume or application form. As such, the EEOC will use these guidelines anytime it's faced with a discrimination in hiring complaint, so every HR manager needs to be familiar with the uniform guidelines and its requirements. One of the most common issues in larger organizations and even in some mid-sized firms is the case where a manager has found a test on the internet and they decide to use it as a candidate screening device. In many, if not most cases, the test has no evidence of validation in any form and should therefore not be used in a selection process. If the EEOC investigates a complaint about employment testing being discriminatory, the company will have to show that the selection procedure that's being used is valid as a measure for filling the job. If the company can't show that the measure is valid, it's likely that the EEOC will consider the test a discriminatory hiring practice. In 1988, the Employee Polygraph Protection Act, or EPPA, was passed. This act made it illegal to use a polygraph to test employees' honesty in most circumstances. However, there are 2 exceptions for organizations and other businesses. There are other exceptions for government and national security. The use of polygraph tests on prospective employees by any private employer whose primary business for the purpose consists of providing armored car personnel, personnel engaged in the design, installation, or maintenance of security or alarm systems, and uniformed or plainclothes security personnel. Also, the use of polygraph tests by any employer authorized to manufacture, distribute, or dispense a controlled substance listed on Schedule 1, 2, 3, or 4 of Section 202 of the Controlled Substances Act. If you own a store and things are being stolen, can you give a polygraph test to all of your employees? No, the Act says you can't. There is one other case, however, where an employer might be allowed to request that an employee submit to testing using a polygraph, but the use is severely restricted. This only can occur when all of the following apply. There is an active investigation involving economic loss or injury to the employer's business. The employee had access to the property. The employer has reasonable suspicion that the employee was involved in the incident or activity under investigation. The employer executes and maintains a statement of the facts that will be retained for a period of 3 years and provides a copy of the statement to the employee. However, due to the nature of this exemption for ongoing investigations and the ability of the employee to deny the request, a polygraph test is probably not generally of significant value to the average employer. As such, the company would be advised to avoid the use of polygraph in these situations unless there is a clear and convincing evidence of the employee's involvement. The basis for this testing was an attempt to make sure that a potential employee didn't have a genetic predisposition to certain known illnesses or diseases that might adversely affect the person's ability to work. However, many individuals felt that this was a significant invasion of their privacy and, as a result, shouldn't be used by a potential employer. As a result of these concerns, Congress began looking at the issue of genetic testing, and in 2008, it passed the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, known as GINA, which protects people from discrimination by health insurers and employers on the basis of their DNA information. Illegal tests can result in lawsuits. Some of the major types of written tests include skill tests, personality tests, interest tests, cognitive ability tests, which are tests of general intelligence or some type of job-related aptitude, and honesty tests. Today, written tests are a common part of the selection process. In fact, 80% of mid-size and large companies use personality and ability assessments for entry and mid-level management positions to help ensure the right fit between the job candidate and the job. Companies are seriously concerned that job candidates don't have the skills to match up with their education and degrees, and with good reason. One recent study noted that millennials are on track to be the best educated generation in U.S. history, but their educational level isn't translating into the job skills that most employers seek. And a number of other developed countries are having similar problems. So testing is becoming more common to figure out who can perform and who can't. Skills tests can be either written or done in physical form. For now, let's discuss written skills testing. A skills test is simply an assessment instrument designed to determine if you have the ability to apply a particular knowledge set. Personality tests measure the psychological traits or characteristics of applicants to determine suitability for performance in a specific type of job. The Myers-Briggs Type Indicator and the Berkman method are two common personality tests. Interest tests are similar, but they measure a person's intellectual curiosity and motivation in a particular field. Cognitive ability tests are assessments of general intelligence or some type of aptitude for a particular job. Here again, we need to ensure that the tests that may be used are professionally developed, reliable, and valid indicators of a particular ability or knowledge set. Otherwise, we shouldn't use them. As an HR manager, you will have to make decisions about whether or not written testing has value in your particular industry. Physical tests are designed to ensure that applicants are capable of performing on the job in ways defined by the job specification and description. Physical testing will generally be valuable where there are significant physical skills required to perform a job. Skills tests determine whether or not you have the ability to apply or use a particular knowledge set. Physical skills tests are designed to determine whether you have the skills and abilities to perform a particular set of physical tasks. These tests can also be conducted in several different forms, including by administering work sample tests at assessment centers and by using simulations. One option is to have candidates perform a small sample of actual work for the company for free as part of the selection process. Work sample tests are basically what they sound like. We provide a sample of the work that the candidate would perform on the job and ask the candidate to perform the tasks under some type of controlled condition. A simple example of a work sample test might be asking the candidate to type a particular letter and then judging the speed and accuracy of the individual's results. Another might be asking the candidate to lift a package of a similar size and weight to what they'd be lifting on the job. An assessment center is a more detailed physical testing environment. Internal and external candidates for positions are often tested through assessment centers. Assessment centers are places where job applicants undergo a series of tests, interviews, and simulated experiences to determine their potential for a particular job. For physical testing, we can also use simulations, tests where a candidate are put into a high-pressure situation, but in a controlled environment so that the danger and cost are limited. Simulations are very valuable in cases where a real event could be dangerous, emotionally taxing, or cost a lot of money. If the job will require heavy physical exertion, there may be a legitimate need to have individuals submit to a physical exam to ensure that they are healthy enough for the stress. In other cases, we may be required by the state or federal government to have individuals who work in specific fields take a physical exam before they're allowed to work in certain jobs such as driving heavy trucks, DOT physicals, or flying a plane, an FAA physical. Or we may just have our candidates take a physical exam before they start work so that we have a baseline knowledge of their health at the time of hire. We can then use this baseline later to determine whether they are subjected to conditions that harm them physically. For instance, if we have a candidate take a physical and the physician finds out that the candidate has significant carpal tunnel syndrome in the wrists, it makes it harder for the candidate to claim after being hired the job caused the injury. However, we may have to be very aware of the potential for discrimination based on disability if we require a physical exam as a prerequisite to work in our organization. If the exam is not directly related to the essential functions of the job, it may not be advisable for an employer to require it as part of the selection process because of the potential for legal liability and illegal discrimination on the basis of disability. A fitness for duty test simply identifies whether or not an employee is physically capable at a particular point of time for performing a specific type of work. Under what conditions can we generally utilize fitness for duty testing? Federal law notes that we can use a medical examination if it is job-related and consistent with business necessity. A fitness for duty exam is just one type of medical exam. In fact, this type of testing can be superior to drug testing for certain business purposes. For instance, if you manage a courier who drives a company vehicle and the driver is not abusing drugs but has gotten any sleep in the past couple of days, a fitness for duty test would be quite likely to identify that the courier is unable to make quick, correct decisions, while a drug test would show that the courier is not impaired due to drug use. A common form of this type of test is based on individual reaction time, which slows significantly when someone is fatigued. In such a case, the courier would be required to retest or rest for a certain period of time before being allowed to drive the vehicle. Another plus of this type of testing is that it's much less invasive and much more acceptable to employees than drug testing. If you develop your own test, you still have to provide support for its reliability and validity, two critically important concepts in the world of selection testing. So you have to use experts to develop the test, which takes time and significant amounts of money. The other option is to use tests that have already been developed and tested for reliability and validity. The problem here is that you usually have to pay a fee for every single time you give the test, not to mention the time and effort to give and assess the tests themselves. So testing can be time-consuming and expensive for employers. Therefore, testing has to pay for itself through its ability to help you hire applicants who are in fact a good fit for the job in the organization. It may save you time and money by preventing you from hiring them and immediately losing employees who are a bad fit, preventing negligent hires, and improving worker productivity by maximizing the chance of hiring good fit employees. This justifies the significant investment in the selection test itself. In a structured interview, all candidates are asked the same list of prepared questions. In an unstructured interview, there are no pre-planned questions or sequence of topics. In a semi-structured interview, the interviewer has a list of questions but also asks unplanned questions. The interviewer departs from the structure when and where appropriate. At the same time, using a standard set of questions makes it easier to compare candidates. The amount of structure you should use depends on your experience as an interviewer. The less experience you have, the more structure you need. One thing to keep in mind is the need to develop a set of consistent questions to ask all candidates so that you can objectively compare the candidates and select the most qualified. The questions you ask give you control over the interview. They allow you to get to the information you need to make a decision. Today, HR interviewers prefer behavior-based questions that ask candidates to describe how they handled specific situations. There are two basic types of behavior-based questions: situational questions and behavior-descriptive questions. A situational question puts you in a hypothetical situation that you would likely face in the job you're applying for. On the other hand, a behavioral descriptive question asks you in an open-ended format about something specific that you have done in the past. These questions help us find out what you've done in the past and what you're likely to do in the future. Completing the interview preparation steps will help you improve your interviewing skills. Step 1. Review the job description and specifications. You cannot effectively match a candidate to a job if you're not thoroughly understanding that job. Read and become familiar with the job description and job specifications. Step 2. Prepare a realistic job preview. Candidates should understand what the job is and what they're expected to do. They should know the good and the bad points of the job. Plan how you'll present a realistic job preview for your next selection process. Step 3. Plan the type of interview. What level of structure will you use? The interview should take place in a private, quiet place, without interruptions. It would be appropriate to begin the interview in an office and then tour facilities while asking questions. Decide when the tour will take place and what questions will be asked. Take a list of the questions that you want to ask during that interview. Step 4. Develop questions for all candidates. Your questions should be job-related, non-discriminatory, and in the case of a structured interview, asked of all candidates. Use the job description and specifications to develop questions that relate to each job, task, and responsibility. Use a mixture of close-ended, open-ended, and hypothetical questions. Don't be concerned about the order of questions, just write them out at this point. Step 5. Develop a form. Once you've created a list of questions, determine the sequence. Start with the easy questions. One approach starts with close-ended questions, moves on to more open-ended questions, and then to hypothetical questions and uses probing questions as needed. Another approach structures the interview around the job description and specifications. Each responsibility is explained, and then questions are asked related to each. Step 6. Develop questions for each candidate. Review each candidate's application and resume. You'll most likely want to add specific questions to a copy of the form to verify or clarify some of the information provided. The job interview is commonly given the most weight in the selection process. Following these steps, you'll do a better job of interviewing candidates. Step 1. Open the interview. Develop rapport. Put the candidate at ease by talking about some topic not necessarily related just to the job. Maintain eye contact in a way that's comfortable for you and the candidate. Step 2. Present the realistic job preview. Be sure the candidate understands the job and its requirements. Answer any questions the candidate has about the job and the organization. Step 3. Ask your questions. To get the most out of a job interview, you must take notes on responses to those questions. Tell the candidate that you've prepared a list of questions that you plan on taking notes as you ask those questions and dialoguing with them about the job. Step 4. Introduce top candidates to coworkers. Introduce top candidates to people with whom they'll be working to get a sense of the candidate's interpersonal skills and overall attitude. Step 5. Close the interview. Be honest and don't lead candidates on. Thank candidates for their time and tell them what the next step in the selection process is. Tell candidates when you'll contact them in the future. Be sure to get coworkers' impressions of each candidate because they'll have to work with the candidate if they're hired. Background checks are needed to help prevent negligent hiring. During the selection process, in addition to verification of the information on a candidate's application and their resume, several other types of background checks may or may not be appropriate. It's not unusual for the background check to be a simple pass or fail. Background checks can become rather expensive depending on which checks we do and how often we have to do them, so they're usually left until we have at least narrowed down the list of candidates to a final few, or in most cases, even a final candidate. We may offer employment to the candidate conditioned on passing various background checks. Remember, though, that you cannot use a background check to discriminate in violation of federal or state law. Although several states have recently put limits on its use, one of the most commonly used background check is the credit check. Credit checks are subject to the Fair Credit Reporting Act, known as FCRA, which requires employers to disclose to the applicant that they will use credit reports for employment decisions. The Act also says that if the information on the credit report results in adverse employment action, the employer has to give a copy of the report to the person and inform the applicant of their rights under FCRA, including the right to dispute the report. When can employers complete credit checks on applicants, and why would they do it at all? Credit checks will most likely be done if applicants will have access to any money or if they will work with the company's financial information. Credit checks may also be done with other employees who evaluate their personal responsibility to see if they have a habit of being dishonest in credit transactions. A history of not paying bills tells the organization that the person is likely to be dishonest in other ways as well. Does something like a bankruptcy on your credit report automatically knock you out of contention for a job? No, in fact, by law, the company can't refuse to hire you solely because of a negative issue like a bankruptcy on a credit check. However, again, if your credit report shows a pattern of failure to live up to your credit obligations, the company can and probably will use that information to remove you from the applicant pool, as long as the company's home state allows it. Credit reports also give the employer other reference information that can be used in background checks. All states allow criminal background checks, at least in some cases. However, laws vary so significantly across jurisdictions that it's difficult to enumerate the circumstances in which criminal background checks are allowed. Can or should a criminal record keep someone from being hired? It depends on a few things: the nature and seriousness of the offense, how long ago it occurred, and what type of job the individual is being considered for. Reference checks include not only calls to references that are provided by the applicant, but also reference letters from employers, personal letters of recommendation, and possibly cold calls from previous employers. Finally, with the ability to access very large amounts of information via the internet, virtually all organizations are using the internet to do research on job candidates whenever they're allowed to do so by applicable federal, state, and local laws. Googling a candidate's name is becoming a standard practice. Should social media be used as a selection device? HR departments are going to use the tools that they have available to get the best possible people, so social media will most likely continue to be a tool that's used in the recruiting and selection process. However, we need to be very careful to avoid using information that would be illegal in consideration for employment. Employers will most likely do a web search on you as a candidate in today's business world, and this goes for part-time jobs, summer jobs, and internships, as well as full-time positions. Also, make sure your email addresses and telephone messages are professional for job searching. There are two basic methods that we use to make final selection decisions for an organization. The multiple hurdle selection model requires that each applicant must pass a particular selection test in order to go on to the next test. If an applicant fails to pass any of the selection tests in the process, the person is immediately removed from the running. On the other hand, the compensatory selection model allows an individual to do poorly on a test but make up for that poor grade by doing exceptionally well on other tests. Again, each step of the selection process, like interviews and background checks, is a test. Using the compensatory model allows the employer to rank each of the candidates based on their overall score from all of the testing. The employer can also group candidates based on this information. So after all selection activities are completed, compare each candidate's qualifications to job specifications. Identify whether or not this person really wants to do the job, and analyze whether or not the individual has been basically honest during the selection process. Do all of this to determine who would be the best possible fit for the job. Be sure to get coworkers' impressions of each candidate when appropriate, because they'll have to work and get along with one another depending on who you hire. Diversity should also be considered during the selection process. So to bring this selection process to an end, contract the best possible candidate and offer that person the job. If the candidate does not accept the job offer or accepts but leaves after a short period of time, you can frequently offer the next best candidate the job.